Okay, so this is going to be fun because I have 7 minutes of an interview for you. The first 7 minutes, this will be chapter 1 of the Unseen and Unheard Interview series with Gary Lee Duncan. And I need to explain to you why I only have 7 minutes to show for 7 months worth of work. So, by way of explanation, 10 months ago, I began a dialogue with Gary Lee Duncan. I was hoping for an opportunity to get to know him and interview him on my audio podcast. You see, I have this idea that wisdom in surviving electromagnetic poisoning is the product of electromagnetic suffering and time. That might look something like this. So one of the unfortunate challenges that this dynamic presents, it's that it's really hard to find such people since they're either not online at all or very rarely. Communication is difficult. Many can't access the internet at all. Cell phones are, of course, unusable, and even a regular landline, it might be impossible. In short, they're almost impossible to find and communicate with. Almost. I was intrigued several years ago when I read Shannon Rowan's Wi-Fi Refugee. And she mentioned Gary. It wasn't the devilishly handsome mention that caught my attention, of course, but rather the fact that there was this character severely afflicted by electromagnetic poisoning and synthetic chemical exposures. Yet he was out there in the desert and he was helping others suffering from the same things. So last year, in preparation for an interview with Julia Lupine regarding her odyssey and her book Under a Rock, Julia mentioned the same Gary Lee Duncan. I knew I had to find Gary, but how? No website, no social media, no podcast, nada. You see, Gary doesn't have a home like you and I. He's not homeless per se. He is nomadic. He's been moving around continuously, are you ready for this? For the last 30 years. Gary's been living in some of the last remaining pristine places in the United States. Places without cell phone service, places that are still fit for life and health. Places with almost an undefiled electromagnetic environment, still suited for optimal life, like I say, and health, but difficult to find and access. And now and then, Gary and I can communicate. We can communicate only over email when he can access a hardwired internet connection. It goes like this. It might be days or weeks between such opportunities, but we made it work. No, we can't see one another in real time. We haven't found a way to do that yet. My traveling to visit him, which I would love to do, is impossible for electromagnetic reasons. And the same went for him visiting me. So, how does one interview with someone you may never see or hear in real time? Gary and I found that we have a lot of parallels in our lives, and one of them is that we're both glass half full guys. So we slowly, painstakingly shared our stories with one another, and we began planning. How could we accomplish an interview together? It's taken a lot of time. It's taken a lot of energy and effort for both of us. And after 7 months, we had put together a plan and had something to show for it. We would conduct an interview, perhaps more like a conversation, via audio files transmitted over email with days or weeks between. Now, question to Gary, wait days or weeks for a response, get an answer from Gary. You get the idea. This interview might take forever. And here's the thing. I hope it does take forever. Gary has a wealth of wisdom to share, and his story is truly fascinating. With ongoing updates, I decided to share what I have so far because the future is uncertain, and besides, we all need to slow down and take time to understand one another. I hope you'll join Gary and I on this adventure. This is part 1. I hope you'll make time to listen to someone who has endured so much with his electromagnetic poisoning. And Gary has those rare qualities that I love. He enjoys helping others, and he's not afraid to communicate. Award-winning writer, poet, musician, cabinet maker to the stars, electromagnetic survivor, and one of the greatest EMF advocates ever. Here's how the story begins. My guest today is Gary Duncan. The best way I can describe Gary is that he's a multi-decade survivor of electromagnetic poisoning, living in the desert southwest of the United States. Gary was mentioned in 2 books, at least that I know of, Wi-Fi Refugee and Under a Rock, as one who helped the authors to survive this modern-day poisoning. I have a feeling Gary has helped many more than these 2. Gary, welcome to the EMF Remedy Podcast.
Keith, thanks a million for having me here today. This is really an honor.
So, when and how did you first realize that synthetic EMF was a problem in your life?
Well, Keith, of all the people that should have known about electric poisoning, electrosensitization, I started out at age 17 as a disc jockey. I had to get a Federal Communications Commission license to run a commercial radio transmitter, and that training warned vociferously about the dangers of being exposed to the radiation from radio transmitters, what we now know as radio frequency. In the University of Colorado, I was studying physics, of course, training in electromagnetic field theory. And still, when it actually happened to me and I started getting sick, it never occurred to me that electricity could be what was causing it. I was one of the top 10 cabinet makers in Hollywood. My work was in the chairman of the board for Warner Brother Pictures, Dustin Hoffman, Bruce Springsteen, Olivia Newton-John, Rita Moreno, Steven Spielberg, and I just kept getting more famous and making more money and sicker by the day, never realizing what was going on. That all fell apart. I ended up moving back to Montrose to be with aging parents. I went through 5 MDs and 3 years of studies with the Veterans Administration. They all thought I was wacko, told me to see a shrink and take Xanax. If I'd have done that, I'd be dead today. By accident, if there is such a thing, I ran into a lady, Caroline Metzler, who is a newly graduated acupuncture therapist from Santa Fe and a protege of Dr. Erica Elliott, who's an MD and world famous as a chemical sensitive in Santa Fe. And Caroline looked at my lifestyle and said, well, you know, you have a terrible diet. You have all of these chemical toxins in your life. She went to work cleaning up my life. That went on for a year. It really worked. Things were getting better, but I could never get on top of it. I was at a drumming circle with one of my best friends, Dr. Roland Halsworth, who is a native German licensed naturopathic physician and very well trained in what the Germans call the Baubiologie movement. In the United States now, it's called building biology. And he looked at me and he said, well, if you're chemically sensitive, you're electromagnetic sensitive. Well, quite frankly, I thought it was a bunch of new age wacko woo-woo, and electricity couldn't possibly do that to me. Well, it was doing that to me, and this went on for about a year, and Roland one day he said, because I'm a terrible whiner. When I'm sick, I really whine. And he says, well, I'm sick and tired of listening to you whine. I come to your house tomorrow with my meters. You be there. So I was. And I lived in this little tiny converted travel trailer. In fact, I'm sitting in it right now in the middle of the Utah desert 30 years later. And he gets out his electromagnetic field meters and starts going around the trailer. And we now know that I react to electrical fields on the order of 2 volts per meter, which is almost imperceptible. The average reading his meters showed in my living environment was 3,000 to 4,000 volts per meter. But the real crux, the real eye-opener experience was I had this horrible sinus drainage. When I laid down in my bed, it felt like somebody was pouring gasoline down my nostrils and lighting a match. And when I'd sit up in a couple of minutes, it'd go away until I laid back down again. Roland knew about the sinus drainage. He didn't know about the bed. And he takes out his electrical field meter and he sticks it in the middle of my bed, because that's, as you know, as a practitioner in the field, that's one of the first things trained professionals check out is our sleeping environment. And it's 0 in the middle of my bed, and when he moves it up to my headboard, it peaked. And I'm standing there looking over his shoulder, watching that meter, and all of a sudden the lights are starting to come on. And he said, oh, well, you lay down, all hell breaks loose, and you sit up and you're just fine. I said, how in the hell did you know that? So he went outside. He stuck a brass rod in the ground outside the trailer, ran a wire inside, hooked it and touched it to the aluminum strip that was behind my headboard, going clear across the trailer and right underneath an octopus electrical outlet. It was inducting electrical fields 3/4 of an inch from my cerebral cortex. And he touched that to ground. He says, okay, lay down. And I said, Roland, this hurts like hell. I'm not going to lay down. He said, oh, no, it won't hurt now. So I laid down. Then he starts talking to me. And about 2 or 3 minutes later, he looks down at me. He says, so how's the pain? And all of a sudden I realized, my God, this is the first time in years I've laid down in my bed and the pain was gone. And then he looks at me right in the nose and he says, watch out. And he lifted that grounding wire up off of that aluminum strip. And there was a bolt of lightning that went through me, and the smashing of my denial about the poisoning of synthetic electricity that I guarantee you in spades will never leave me till my dying day. That's only the beginning of a 30-year story, but that's the example of what it takes for most of us to decimate the denial about the poisoning, toxic effect of synthetic electricity in our lives.